right, we're on. So Emma is going to talk to us tonight about climates of change in 18th century Maine. She's at a doctoral candidate at Georgetown and is about to actually start her own assistant professorship at Elon in North Carolina. Her dissertation was on everyday climate change, seasons, and gender in the rural British Northern Atlantic, which is so pertinent to us. Emma's also from Maine. She's from Belfast. So it's awesome to have a Mainer with us. And she's going to talk about communities and the way that they have responded to climate change, especially along gender lines. So we're really excited to hear about that. I also want to note that the program is sponsored by a podcast produced by Massachusetts Historical called Historians and Their Histories. That's really interesting and it's all available online, so you should absolutely check that out. They're a great resource. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here, Emma.
Wonderful. Sarah and Larissa, thank you so much for that introduction and for having me. It's such a delight to be at least virtually in Brunswick for the evening. As Sarah mentioned, I grew up in Belfast, and I was lucky enough to spend 4 years in Brunswick during my time at Bowdoin College. So it's very nice to be here with you all. Um, I am going to spend the next 30 minutes or so telling you a little bit about the history of climate change in Maine from around 1700 to around 1800. So a little bit of a plan. First, we'll talk a little bit about climate change and what it looked like in the 18th century. And then I have three stories to share with you. One about agriculture and how people produced food in Maine during this period and how that was influenced by climate change. One story about food preparation, particularly cooking, and food preservation. And then another story about social life and how people um, lived and interacted with each other during periods of climate change. And then I'll be trying to put that set of stories into context with the climate crisis of today. And then I'll be delighted to open it up for questions and conversation. So as Sarah mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And I look forward to getting to them in about half an hour. I had to put a map of Brunswick on the screen just because it's been a while since I was up there. So we'll send some cherry blossom energy your way up from Washington, D.C. this evening. So, as we all know, spring in Maine can be a little bit of a challenge, as I'm sure you're experiencing right now. And I want to start this talk by emphasizing that climate change in Maine and living with climate variability in Maine has been a part of the experience of many Mainers over the past several hundred years. This is an image of an almanac from Portland in 1802, when Maine was still part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And you can see here that folks use these almanacs to learn about the environmental changes that they might be experiencing over the course of the year. So there's one page for every month. And during that time, we have a description of spring work. So in this case, we talk about tilling, feeding, fence repair, and other kind of maintenance work. And then you'll also see for April, which we're almost there, that we have, for instance, on April 14th, right here, pleasant weather for a few days, and then comes rain. So this is your weather forecast if you're living in Portland in 1802, consulting this almanac to figure out what the weather of the time, of the month might look like for you, how that's going to influence how you live your day-to-day life, much as we do today. Nobody panic. I promise we will get back to history very soon. But I do want to show a couple of graphs first to talk about the climate conditions that folks experienced in Maine during the 18th century. So, as you may know, Earth's climate has changed a great deal over the course of Earth's history and over the course of human history. Um, so we have, for instance, here, reconstructions of temperature on the left, temperature here on the left, temperature on the right, and hydroclimate on the left. There we go. I clearly needed to look at my captions one more time. And you'll see extreme variability in these temperature and precipitation patterns over the course of human history. But what I want to highlight here is this blue band that says LIA. That stands for Little Ice Age, which is a period of global climate variability over the course of about the 1300s through the middle of or the beginning of the 19th century. So ending just about when this talk ends in about 1820 or 1850, just as Maine becomes a state. The Little Ice Age is, as I said, a global climate phenomenon not caused by human beings, but caused by natural variabilities in Earth's climate system, primarily sunspots or reduced solar energy reaching Earth's surface through reduced solar activity, by volcanic eruptions, which basically react with the atmosphere to prevent solar energy again from reaching Earth's surface by creating sulfate aerosols in the atmosphere, which reflect sunshine, solar energy, and also by the internal variability of how heat circulates around the globe, both in the atmosphere and in the oceans. So the disruptions between these different climate patterns and the interactions between those disruptions are what provoke the climate change that we know as the Little Ice Age today. And when we look at the 18th century, that's the last century of the Little Ice Age. And if you were in undergraduate class, I would say, well, what do you notice about this graph? But because you are all adults, I think we can move on from that. And I'll note that this is the 1961 to 1990 average temperature. And you'll notice that the average temperature for the difference between that average and the temperature of the 18th century is significant. We have almost half a degree Celsius on average, and often much lower than the average temperature for Maine during this period, or than the average sort of modern day temperature for Maine during this period. And so we have, again, this unpredictability, as well as cooler than average temperatures and periods of storminess. So this is our final graph for the evening, I promise. And this describes the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is basically the extent to which there are drought-like conditions. So in the minus range, those would be drier conditions. In the plus or positive range, those would be wetter conditions. And again, this is based on sort of a modern day average. So you'll see again, extreme variability in hydroclimate or rain and snow during the 18th century. And you'll notice that on average, we're looking at some, drier times and also some outlying extreme drought periods. I'm looking here at 1750, especially, but also earlier in about 1700. Again, these are caused, or these conditions are caused by a variety of factors. But I show you these graphs to illustrate the kind of broad climate realities of 18th century environmental change in Maine. And so now we come back to another almanac, right? This one is from a little bit earlier. It's from the 1790s, and it's actually from Massachusetts, but a lot of folks in Maine, especially in southern and mid-coast Maine, would have relied on almanacs like this, again, to dictate how they might conduct their work. There would also be information about various agricultural tasks, when to plant, for instance, information about the tides for folks going out on various boats. And you'll see, for instance, here on July 10th, I believe. Yes, July 10th, we have good hay weather predicted. So the important thing to underscore as we go forward here with the rest of these stories is that folks in Maine during this period responded to these climate variabilities that I described on the previous couple of slides with a great deal of flexibility, which allowed them to cope with climate change, even when it may have disrupted food production strategies to some extent. So, for instance, we have here the diary of Henry Sewell. Henry Sewell was, of course, an American Revolutionary War general who then settled in Hollowell. Um, he was an avid gardener and kept a diary for many, many years over the course of basically the second half of his life. And one thing I love about Henry Sewell's diary is that at the end of the year, every December 31st, he would write down, how the year had gone for him. Oh, this year wasn't too cold. It was pretty good. Oh, a very unusually cold year. And I like to think of him like sitting in Hollowell with his little New Year's Eve drink, sort of reflecting on the past year's weather. But on May 1st, 18 this is not December 31st, 1816. This is May 1st, 1799. He writes, cold. The season is nearly a month later than usual. So Henry would typically plant his potatoes around the beginning of April. But this year, the extreme cold frosts in the spring meant that he had to delay his agricultural calendar by almost a month. He did not reflect in his kind of end of year review, if you will, that this had notably disrupted his his annual food production. Instead, he reflected on the fact that he had to make a change to his agricultural practices in response to the climate variability, rather than sort of throwing up his hands and saying, well, I guess I won't have any potatoes this year. The Maine Agricultural Society is also particularly focused on figuring out how to increase agricultural productivity in Maine during this time. They are generally, the Maine Agricultural Society has so many documents held at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, who are also sponsoring this talk. And Maine Agricultural Society folks are really working during this period to make sure that the agricultural productivity of Maine can be as great as possible, kind of despite the harsher climate than you might have found in like southern Massachusetts. So here we have a diagram of the chestnut tree and the sort of potential outline for planting chestnut trees in order to gather the nuts. It says here the nuts can be gathered and dried and put in sand until the time of planting. So you can basically continue to propagate your chestnut crop during this period. But chestnut trees could also serve as a useful windbreak and a way to shore up the soil. So agricultural folks working during this time to make sure that their environments were as resilient as possible could plant additional trees to basically act as a windbreak, to enrich and strengthen their soil, and overall, again, increase that resilience to climate variability. The Agricultural Society was also really interested in the preservation of food. So not only was it important to produce or make chestnuts or butter or corn or Henry Sewell's potatoes, but it's also really important because we can't just like pop to Hannaford and fetch our butter. It's also important to make sure that that food can keep throughout the year. This is a big component of the work that I do in researching the role of gender in climate change, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But here we have a paper from the Maine Agricultural Society talking about methods for preserving butter, because most folks would not milk their cows in the winter in order to allow the cows to maintain as much strength and energy themselves. During a time of, less abundant grass and hay. So we're instructed here to preserve our butter, to take 2 parts of the very best common salt, 1 part of a good loaf of sugar, and some saltpeter, and beat them well together, and then use that mixture to basically preserve and kind of pickle the butter so that it can keep more effectively for a longer period of time. Um, but then what I think is really interesting here, and what I think points to the kind of constant creativity and resilience of folks living in the context of climate change during this period, is that there is this second paragraph here where they say, would it not keep equally well in a firkin, which is a slightly larger container? They say, well, perhaps it would be more effectively preserved from the air by pouring melted butter over top of the additional butter in the firkin. So we have like 2 different kinds of butter working here. Then they say the butter will form a perfect crust, which I just think is an amazing turn of phrase. Um, but we have here again another example of folks working to preserve the food that takes them so much time and energy to produce, to make sure that it can last during periods of the year where that food might not otherwise be available. I always like to mention also the importance of food preparation for maintaining human health during this period. Some of you may be familiar with the diary of Martha Ballard, who is a housewife living in Hollowell during this time. And Martha kept a lovely diary in which she recorded, I think, almost 30 years of work that she carried out as a midwife and healer during this during the second half of the 18th century. She mentions the weather a lot. Most of her diary entries, excuse me, start with clear, pretty good weather for the season, rainy, cold. Um, and for reasons that I'll talk more about in a little bit, she's often discussing the kind of conditions under which she has to do her healing work, right? But she's also working in her garden. She's producing foodstuffs that can facilitate health among her patients and also keep them nourished, right? In a time of year, perhaps, where there might not be as much food available. Right about now in March, actually, is when people's larders start to really kind of run dry, but no new crops are quite being produced yet. So on September 24th, 1786, Martha describes in her diary that she gave a patient a portion of rhubarb from her garden. I think this was probably prepared in some like a decoction or perhaps a tincture. And it could have been used to aid in indigestion in her patient. But she also says we killed a chicken and we made some broth. So this broth is not only nourishment, right, but it's also a particularly nutrient-rich medicinal food that might be able to support her patients if they are um, ill in a variety of ways. Chicken soup obviously sort of transcends space and time as a curative measure. You'll note that September 24th, Martha has rhubarb available in her garden, and she has a chicken that's been eating bugs and grass all summer, and it's much more effective, shall we say, to kill a chicken and prepare food, prepare a broth from it during this period than it would be to be making chicken broth from a chicken in March. So again, it's these kind of constant seasonal um, adaptations and responses to environmental change and to social factors, which allow Mainers to continue to kind of live alongside changing environments during this period. Um, I also think, though, that the constant letters and diaries that folks sent back and forth during the 18th century highlight the importance of environmental change and climate change to everyday life. This is a letter from Eliphalet Smith to his wife Anne, who was traveling in Boston visiting a friend. Um, these letters are from the Maine Historical Society, actually in Portland. And Eliphalet says to his wife, we had no falling weather in Portland, but the next Thursday it began to snow. This is on April 18th, and continued snowing the remainder of the day and part of the night. And then there's a great alteration of weather in a few minutes, and the wind chops around to the west northwest, and it's squally and cold. So in this letter between husband and wife, we really see the significant uh, place that unpredictable and somewhat unseasonable weather played and the place that it occupied in folks' minds during this time. So not only are, these letters talking about the maintenance of the store that this couple runs together, and the sort of other letters and packages which are being sent back and forth, but the weather conditions are going to influence all of that, right? They're going to influence the post. They're going to send between each other. He says, contrary winds and gloomy weather prevented me from sending this letter from a friend who's going to Lowell in Massachusetts. So I think that, again, this at first blush is kind of an average letter, right? It's a husband and a wife writing back and forth about the weather. But ultimately, what this demonstrates to me is that climate change that happens on a global scale, thinking back to those graphs, is often expressed in local communities as unpredictable weather patterns, which may be extreme or disruptive. Um, and yet, nonetheless, Eliphalet is able to send his letter via the post office, and he says, "You'll probably get it tomorrow morning." Um, so again, this omnipresence of unseasonable weather combined with the sort of persistence in the face of climate variability. Harriet Otis wrote to her sister Mary a couple of years before Eliphalet and Anne were corresponding to talk about another visit from Harriet and her mother to Mary, who was living in Boston at the time. She says, Mama has given up entirely for today. If the weather continues so hot, she may have to delay her visit. Particularly if the weather looks uncertain or threatens to be extremely warm. So again, if we think back to our almanac from a couple of slides ago, forecasting thunderstorms during August, this letter demonstrates that it's not just cold, wind, rain, what we might think of as kind of unseasonable, unpleasant, hazardous weather, but that warm weather could be just as challenging for folks to experience and could also kind of occupy just as important a role in the mind of correspondents. I also want to highlight, I don't know how many of you have used microfilm machines, but this this letter I think is a particularly good example of kind of looking through not only old letters from the 18th and 19th centuries, but looking at them in a little microfilm machine with your eyes in the little goggles, um, sort of skimming to see who's mentioning the weather, who's mentioning any kind of particularly extreme climate event that I might know about from the data that I showed you earlier. So again, microfilm, tricky to work with, absolutely worth it to have documents like this letter from Harriet to Mary. So there are countless events described by the folks I study in Maine during this period, where they talk about the disruption of particular weather phenomena to their agricultural practice, to their travel, to their food preparation and preservation. One of the most notable instances of that is in 1816. 1815 is on record as a really significant year of volcanic eruption. Mount Tambora in what's now Indonesia erupts, and the sulfur dioxide particles in that volcanic eruption, think of that big volcanic cloud, those particles react with the atmosphere, form sulfate aerosols, which then limit the amount of solar energy that can reach Earth's surface. Again, this is happening in Indonesia. A year later, in Maine, they say it's fair and very drying. But grass is very much winter killed and backward, and so is corn and grain. Labor high and money scarce. The farmers complain very much. This is from the Maine Farmer and Journal of the Arts. From 1816. And we can link works such as this, entries such as this from 1816 to that particular volcanic eruption from the year before. It basically takes about a year for the those sulfate aerosols to travel through the atmosphere and for that consequence of the volcanic eruption to be felt as far away as Maine. This is known as the year without a summer. You may have heard of it. And it's one of those instances that we can kind of hold up in contrast to a kind of discussion of unseasonable or extreme weather, which we know is part of this global climate regime of the Little Ice Age, and say this is directly caused by a volcanic eruption. And we know when that volcanic eruption happened, and we know exactly what happened in Maine, partially as a result of that climate disruption. So people have been looking for a very long time now to the history of climate change to tell us maybe a little bit more about climate change in the present. We have here something a great entry from the Republican Journal in Belfast from 1907, where they say it was cold in 1816. Read this and cheer up, because there was a particularly cold spate of winters in the early 20th century in Maine as well. So people have been looking back in time to learn how to respond or to environmental change, or to find what I call heritages of climate response and climate adaptation during this period. Um, and that is the case particularly today as we're living in a climate crisis where warming and global climate change are unprecedented in human history and in Earth's history. Again, the climate change that I've been talking about over the course of this presentation is not caused by humans. It's caused by variabilities in Earth's climate system. The climate change described in this graph, which does not go back as far as the 18th century, focuses on climate change caused by human activity, particularly through greenhouse gas emissions due to the burning of fossil fuel and other activities. Um, and I want to emphasize the importance of looking to the past to think about how Mainers have lived with climate change previously, in order to think about climate change mitigation and also climate change responses in the changing environments of today. So with that, I will wrap up the part of the talk where I am the only one talking. I'm more than happy to hear your questions, comments, and to speak more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. That was great. Does anybody have any questions? I think the best approach is either to use that nice little hand raise function, or to pop it in the chat.
I
Anybody?
can start with a direct message that I've received from Neil Piper, who asks, in the early 1800s, nearly 70% of land in southern Maine had been cleared of forests. Does that land clearing affect the climate that Maine experienced? Thank you for the question. The degree to which carbon sequestration, so basically the trapping of carbon in the land, in the soil, may have influenced climate cooling during the 19th century is something that a lot of people study. It's not, it hasn't been definitively proven that this is an influence in Maine in the early 1800s. There, basically the amount of carbon sequestered in the land in only southern Maine is not quite enough carbon released into the atmosphere to make a substantive change. But what is possible is that the uh, reforestation of Maine's landscapes and northern New England landscapes during the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries may have actually contributed to cooling due to the amount of carbon which was newly sequestered as a result of changing land management practices, largely due to mass mortalities of Indigenous Americans in the American Northeast. And then Neil also says, the year without a summer led to a lot of farm failure and a mass migration to Ohio in the following years. Yes, that's absolutely true. The number of Mainers who decamped to Ohio after the year without a summer is really astounding. And a lot of Maine agricultural historians point to the 1816 and 1817 as kind of an inflection point that may have started to transform Maine's agricultural landscape, partially, like largely because of that demographic change. Absolutely. Kudos to you, Emma. Thank you, Larissa. Great information. I'm reading from the chat again. How did you come to be interested in this topic? Was there something in your childhood in Maine that interested you in this, or was it during your Bowdoin years or later? So this topic of environmental history kind of writ large, which is the study of environmental relationships between human beings and the natural world, the environment, was something that I did first discover when I was a student at Bowdoin College, taking classes with Matt Klingel, Connie Chang, Strother Roberts, who are environmental historians. When I was doing my doctoral research at Georgetown, that was when I learned about environmental historians looking particularly at the role of climate change in the human past. When I kind of became interested in using evidence from the natural sciences to augment the historical work. And you saw maybe a little bit of that with the use of graphs, but also the use of textual sources And so it's been an ongoing process, and Maine is such a rich place for the study of environmental change and human relationships with the environment, that it was a great region to include in my research. And of course, it's a lovely place to come and research in. So that certainly helps as well. Okay, we have a comment in the chat from E. Brooke Harlow. Looking on a more macro level, as the climate became warmer with the Little Ice Age winding down, do we see changes in crops produced, less rye, more corn, for example, or agricultural practices? So the biggest changes in agriculture that we start to see as the Little Ice Age winds down are really more about industrialization of agriculture and new agricultural techniques that use more kind of industrial methods. And I say this as someone who studies agricultural change in the 18th century more than in the 19th century. Um, I do think that changing tastes and the changing kind of economic role, the changing price of various crops also contributes to that. So we do start to see less rye and more corn, but that could be because rye is a little bit more cold resistant, but it could also be because rye just doesn't have a super high price in the market, so there isn't as much economic incentive to cultivate it to sell. And then for subsistence, corn has really kind of taken hold. Corn and wheat have really taken hold in subsistence. So that would be another reason for the decline of rye. It's hard to say, right? Because we also start to see more and more potato cultivation in Maine over the course of the second half of the 19th century. Potatoes are a wonderful crop to grow in Little Ice Age like conditions. Um, but they're not being grown more because of climate reasons. They're being grown more because of economic reasons, because there's a market for them and they're easy to produce in Maine's kind of soil and weather conditions. So I would say the changes in agricultural practice are largely due to industrialization and then the demographic change, rather than kind of people coming out of Little Ice Age climate practices. Yeah, exactly. So Neil also adds in the chat that early agriculture was based on the English system, so they were growing more rye and wheat. Um, and then as time and climate changed, more corn and less grain was raised. Yeah, that's absolutely true. That the American agricultural system kind of like continues to evolve over the course of the 19th century, which then kind of ties into that changing subsistence practices that I was talking about. Okay, Sarah says, you talked about the sharing of recipes or preservation techniques. Was that something that allowed women to connect with one another as they face the challenges of a changing climate? Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing that is shows up in the sources, but not as much as you might expect, is people engaging in various forms of collective action, mutual aid, or kind of other community-based climate responses. In the Year Without a Summer, for instance, there are records of basically folks who did have a successful or abundant corn crop being sharing sharing their crops with their neighbors who were not so fortunate. So there are lots of instances of kind of similar sharing tactics. Um, but yeah, I think also this is an important element of women's relationships with each other, facilitating climate adaptation and climate responses. So you'll notice in a lot of recipe books from this period that they'll cite, this is a recipe from Mrs. Smith, that I got from my aunt or from my mother. Um, and sorry, I keep getting distracted by the chat because it's up in the corner and people keep asking questions. So I'm just going to close it and then I'll open it back up. But yeah, so there is certainly a way that women's in knowledge sharing helps them to respond to climate variability. That I don't know if there is more if more climate variability makes them interact more. I would kind of doubt it because there's so much kind of community work occurring already. But I think it's certainly possible that folks might find themselves in particularly dire straits, and that might facilitate more kind of gendered knowledge sharing. Okay, John Emmons says, thank you for your presentation, although mostly later than the period of focus of your talk. Are you familiar with George Perkins Marsh and his 1864 book, Man and Nature, which essentially links climate change and human activities, particularly deforestation? Yes, I am familiar with George Perkins Marsh, although I have not read it in a while. I don't know that I could give you like a full report on Marsh recently, but yes, I am aware of Marsh, and there are other folks during this period who are also during the latter half of the 19th century who basically talk about destruction, environmental destruction, so-called environmental destruction, as a something that is perpetrated by humans and causes climate variability and other kinds of devastating environmental change, but that kind of like places the blame squarely on human beings. Um, yeah, absolutely. Something I'm aware of. There are lots of studies going back to the 18th century even, where folks are really interested in remediating the climate, what they call remediating the climate, trying to make it more hospitable, again, in scare quotes, hospitable, for effectively, as Neil points out, the agricultural practices of England. And the role that particularly forests might play, or that other agricultural or environmental management techniques might play, in kind of facilitating environmental that environmental change. It doesn't really work, the remediation, but Marsh is also building on that kind of understanding of humans' ability to shape the climate. Rob Berg says, thank you for the great information. I am studying how the Great Lakes lumber industry affected localized climate change in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm also curious how this practice might have affected the Northeast. That's so interesting. Sounds like a really important topic. I'm particularly thinking about the fact that precipitation is much more locally kind of dependent than temperature. And I wonder if there are precipitation changes specifically that influenced localized, or if there are localized precipitation changes which are influenced by the lumber industry during this period, or if it's more of like a microclimate temperature thing. And yeah, that is super interesting to think about in the Great Lakes region. I think probably a similar set of consequences would have occurred in the Northeast. As far as the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it's not really my area of expertise, but I can absolutely imagine that the logging industry in Maine would have potentially created kind of similar microclimate changes, which might have also then in turn influenced how the loggers did their work. So it sounds like a great project. Um, yeah, okay. John asks, is the weather variability today similar to the period 1700 to 1800? Um, it is less, it is similar in that both of the variabilities are caused by climate change as well as kind of local natural weather patterns. It is not similar in the sense that the climate change today is occurring on an unprecedentedly quick trajectory. It's occurring incredibly quickly. It's also occurring because of human activity. Um, and it is just off the charts compared to any sort of climate variability seen before in the Holocene, which is this period of time for the past 11,700 years, during which humans have been doing most of their humanitying. So the variability might be this, it might be similar in the sense that the sort of weather whiplash that many of us experience on a daily or a monthly basis may have some comparison to the experiences that the historical protagonists I look at um, might have had. But again, we're on like a really different scale in terms of the extent to which this is disruptive to natural climate fluctuations. You gotta stay hydrated after all that talking.
Any other questions, folks? And it also takes a second to type. I was furiously going like this.
I know. I've been there. I haven't given a talk on Zoom in a while. So I am, it's definitely, it's nice to be able to have the questions in the corner of my screen.
Letting people type if they want to type. But anyway, well, while people are thinking if they've got anything else to add, I just want to say thanks so much, Emma. That was really fascinating. I one thing that I wonder or that comes to mind right away is if there's sort of like any sort of hopeful message. So you've mentioned specifically that like climate change now is on an unprecedented scale, but it does seem like you said that we experience it similarly to people in the past, even if it's much, much more. So I don't know if there's anything kind of to take away from that.
Yeah. I think the knowing that people in the past experienced similar conditions can often bring folks a lot of comfort, especially when environmentally or socially or politically things feel um, really heavy. And so I think historicizing and kind of putting into broader context, like Mainers have a long history of responding to climate change, of experiencing it, of making changes, of banding together. And I think that the heritage is something that we can always draw on. But also, or not but, and there's, there's a long history of environmental variability in Maine, which is kind of within normal realms. And I think it's something that a lot of people love about Maine is the environment and kind of all of its glory. And so I also think talking about the landscape that's important to so many people also often galvanizes people to help protect it. So those are sort of the more meta reasons why I do what I do and why I like to tell stories about how folks lived with climate change in the past.
That's fabulous. I feel like that's why we do history in general, is yeah, to have that connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. All right. Well, if nobody else has any questions, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're coming up on 7 o'clock. But thank you so much, Emma. It was really fabulous having you here. And yeah,
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for the questions, and I hope that I'll see you up in Brunswick in the not too distant future.
absolutely. Come pay us a visit.
I would love to. I would love to. When it gets too hot down here, I'll make my way up
Perfect
north.
time to escape. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.